Hi guys, welcome to the UEBC 2022, hosted by JPS here in Melbourne, Australia. I am joined with Martin Refalo, who has just wrapped up his presentation, fantastic presentation on 3 critical concepts for hypertrophy. And Martin, really just kind of going off some of the topics you were speaking out in the presentation itself, I wanted to get your thoughts when we think about kind of training with reps in reserve. Obviously, you've done some studies on this, kind of how proximity to failure influences hypertrophy and maybe some of the downsides of going closer to failure. And I wanted to get your thoughts on if we assess, okay, well, maybe if we're looking at that strike zone you mentioned and we were to train with maybe 4 reps in reserve as opposed to maybe 0 to 1, if we're still overloading with both of those things, the progression is taking place, progressive overload, I should say, is taking place. What might be some of the things we'd expect to see from, would there be any differences from training with 4 reps in reserve as opposed to 0 to 1?
Okay, so just to clarify, what you're asking is there a difference between training to a 4 RIR versus training to a 0 RIR
Correct.
for muscle hypertrophy?
Correct.
Right, so I guess it's quite hard to answer a question like that, especially when we look at the current literature. What we see in a lot of studies that explore the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy is we see this study design where we have a group of participants training to failure and a group of participants not training to failure. And I guess what you sound like you're interested in is the proximity to failure that a non-failure group would be achieving. And really, based on these studies, it's very hard to actually look at the protocols used and tease out the exact proximity to failure that these participants are training at. So in a lot of studies, participants are, for example, training with 50% of the maximal number of repetitions that they possibly could be training at. And we don't really know what the RIR is. We don't really know what RIR these participants are actually terminating their sets at. And that's a critical limitation of the available literature looking at the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy. So right now, I guess the main conclusion that we can take from the current literature is that failure training is not superior to non-failure training, but we don't really know the specific effect of any given proximity to failure, any given RIR value on muscle hypertrophy. And that's because in many of these studies, researchers haven't tried to control the exact RIR that participants are training at. So in my future research, that is a research gap that I want to try and fill. So right now, there is evidence to support, like I showed in the presentation, this non-linear relationship between proximity to failure, muscle hypertrophy, where there seems to be this threshold point that we need to reach. So what I mean by that is we need to be training close enough to failure to promote the physiological response that is going to induce muscle hypertrophy. But there also seems to be this upper limit where going beyond it seems to come with diminishing returns, right? So going to failure, for example, may, on every one of your sets across a whole workout, may not promote more muscle hypertrophy than, for example, stopping at 0 or 1 RIR. Again, we don't know the exact RIR values that have these effects on muscle hypertrophy. And so all we can really extrapolate from the literature is that there is this nonlinear relationship between RIR and muscle hypertrophy, and we need to be training close enough to failure to induce the response we're after, but pushing all the way to failure on every single set of a workout, right, is likely unnecessary.
So how about, let's say we have a certain demographic who maybe doesn't, let's say training is a focus, let's say they have fantastic recovery capabilities like low life stress, not much else going on, like nutrition is in a good place, they're in a caloric surplus. Would you maybe, what are your thoughts on putting those guys, basically spending more time closer to failure, even going to failure, as opposed to more of a gen pop client? Do you see there being much benefit from that?
Yeah, totally. So I guess training to failure in itself will, in one given set, will maximize the amount of mechanical tension that you can possibly achieve, right? So in a given set, pushing all the way to failure is great. But what we have to consider is how that can affect subsequent sets across a whole workout. So if you're working with a Gen Pop client who simply isn't doing that much training over the week, isn't doing as much training as, for example, a bodybuilder who trains 5 to 6 days a week, then of course you can get away with pushing more of those sets to failure, because the effect of fatigue on subsequent sets and subsequent workouts is lower, right? So it's always important to consider how proximity to failure influences muscle hypertrophy, but how that fits into the overall program and how all these other variables are also influencing the possible mechanical tension that you can achieve in a workout. So, for example, we can think of like the amount of set volume that we are completing in a whole session. If we're not completing that many sets in a session for a given muscle group, right? If we're completing maybe 5 sets or less, which a lot of Gen Pop clients would be doing, then yeah, most of those sets could be performed to failure or just shy from failure. But if you're performing 10 sets, for example, for your quadriceps in a session, then you have to be a bit smarter about the way you program proximity to failure. And yes, some of those sets can still be performed all the way to failure, especially the ones at the end of a workout. But in the earlier stages of a session like that, you have to be smart about the way you program so that you limit that cloud of neuromuscular fatigue that can expand over the session and then hinder your ability to, I guess, complete really productive sets as the session goes on. So, of course, like you mentioned, Luke, you have to consider lifestyle stress, nutrition, and many other factors as well. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that anything that can influence neuromuscular fatigue needs to be considered when you're programming proximity to failure.
Sure. And so to touch on another aspect or another point you raised in your presentation, you were speaking about your study looking at how our perception of how close we push to failure can be quite skewed when it comes to reality. I was wondering, as a coach yourself, have you had any kind of, what's your go-to methodology when it comes to kind of getting your clients more accurate when it comes to their reps in reserve, kind of how they would rate their reps in reserve?
Yeah, so there's many ways you can go about this. I think the first step is to explain these concepts to the client and teach them about the difference between perceived discomfort and true proximities to failure. I think when one gets an understanding of that, it immediately opens them up to more productive training, because they can at least have an understanding of, okay, well, this is perceived discomfort, this is the burn, this is what is probably a signal that I'm getting close to failure, but it may also be a confounding factor. Like I may actually be stopping my sets because of this burn and not because of reaching true proximities to failure. So I think having that conversation is important to begin with. And I think beyond that, actually getting clients to train to failure is likely the gold standard way to improve someone's RIR prediction. So when you push to failure, you are immediately creating this reference point that you can then use in subsequent sets, and that will likely improve your RIR predictions almost immediately. So this is why your training program should always involve some sets to failure, so that you can, I guess, keep that reference point in mind, and you're continually trying to fine-tune your ability to predict RIR accurately, right? So I guess to summarize, training to failure is a must at some point in a program if you want to be accurate with your RIR predictions, and also simply understanding that concept, that difference between perceived discomfort and actually being close to failure, and I guess learning what that feels like in practice, and pushing through hard sets and getting a feel of that. I think that's really important too.
Is there any space for maybe looking at certain exercises when it comes to exposure to failure? Obviously, we know it's, for some individuals, for most individuals, in fact, it's going to be a lot harder to go to failure on something like a hack squat versus a bicep curl or an isolation with a smaller muscle. Would you say there's benefit to almost having someone fail, maybe in a controlled environment, of course, on something like a hack squat, as the feeling you get is a lot different to how it might be failing on a tricep extension or a delt raise? Do you think that's probably a good method for coaches to use?
Yeah, totally. So I think each exercise comes with its own features and demands, and something like a hack squat is very prone to the feelings of perceived discomfort that can confound your RIR predictions. So I think, for example, on the last set of a hack squat, there's absolutely no reason why you can't push a client to failure here and there, especially if you're still in the process of trying to improve their RIR prediction accuracy. So we have to remember that in many of these studies that show participants aren't accurate with their RIR predictions, that's obviously done on one occasion, right? And they get these participants in and they get them to predict their RIR, and in some cases they're not very accurate, especially if they're untrained. But if we were to get those same participants and put them through that same protocol the next day, the day after, and the week after, the accuracy would likely improve, right, from session to session to session. And that's the case with many of our clients as well. Like, accuracy will improve over time if we're continuing to expose our clients to hard training, if we're teaching them about these concepts, and we're pushing them to failure. So for me, a client that isn't very good at predicting RIR, for me that's not too much of a problem, because I know I can improve that over time. I know it will improve over time if we're doing the right things. And like you said, exposing some clients to failure on certain exercises like a hack squat is important, because that's completely different to a bicep curl or a tricep extension as well, where it's probably a bit easier to reach failure with no major issues. I guess you just need to be smart about the way you do that.
Sure, that controlled environment.
Yeah.
Safety first, of course.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, Martin, just to round things out, obviously, your journey's been quite a spectacular one, obviously, coming from just a humble personal trainer to undertaking a PhD, soon to be a doctor, and now you're here today lecturing or presenting at the UEBC. If you could tell young Martin from 10 years ago one piece of advice, what would it be?
One piece of advice, I think that would be to not fear failing, to not fear change. I think there's this one quote that I really love, and I don't know it off the top of my head right now, but if you maintain ambition throughout your career, there's nothing really to fear. Like, don't fear change, don't fear failure. The only thing to fear is a loss of ambition. That's a quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and that stuck with me probably over the past 2 to 3 years. And if I was to tell young Martin one thing, it would probably be that. There's been a lot of change, a lot of times where I've questioned myself over the last 10 years, but I think I've maintained ambition, and that's part of the reason why I'm here today.
Yeah, I think I would all agree. Martin, very ambitious, fantastic presentation, and once again, thank you for taking the time to sit down with me. Guys, I think we'll wrap things up there. If you missed Martin's presentation, it will be available for you to see on the UEBC replay, so please keep an eye out on our socials for that. Martin, for the last time, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down and for presenting. And guys, we will see you soon.
Thank you.